there's concerns following the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas leader, is a top leader, was part of the negotiating team that was crafting out a ceasefire agreement between Hamas and Israel to see an end, or at least a ceasefire, in the war in Gaza at the moment. I speak now to Haggai Matar, who is the executive director of 972 magazine. It's an independent online non-profit magazine. It's run by a group of Palestinian and Israeli journalists. And I'm joined now by Haggai on the line. Just morning, Haggai. Thanks so much for joining us. Just before the strikes, the killings this week of Ismail Haniyeh and also the strikes in Lebanon, how close would we have been to a ceasefire being reached between Hamas and Israel, particularly pertaining to the events in Gaza over the last while? Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me. Well, I think we have been hearing talk about how close we are to signing, and I think could have been very likely, could have been very possible to sign a deal actually for quite some time now. But I don't think we were actually close to a deal just because Netanyahu does not want one. It's basically been his decision, it's his policy to continue the war. I think he wants the war to go on at least until November, so that he can influence the elections in the US and support his ally Donald Trump. And by prolonging the war until then, I don't think he can withstand politically within his own coalition and in his attempt to get Trump elected. For both these reasons, he doesn't want a deal, which is why we were not even close.
So if a deal was not close or unlikely before, a deal is now, completely off the table?
I actually think it's been interesting because if you listen to Hezbollah, last week they fired a missile killing 12 children in a football yard in the Israel-occupied Golan Heights. But even after the assassination, they said, we will retaliate, and still we are interested in a ceasefire. If the war in Gaza ends, we will end the war in the north of Israel. So they're not taking it off the table. Hamas is not taking it off the table. I think we will see some escalation, but a deal is still possible if Israel was interested.
I'd like your thoughts on Benjamin Netanyahu's first international trip since October. He addressed the US Congress 2 weeks ago. Intense applause within the US House at the time, but I've also heard and I've read some reports that the speech was broadcast in squares in Tel Aviv. CBS and South African journalist Deborah Patter reporting for CBS News in Tel Aviv, saying that at the start of that speech, the squares were relatively full, people watching on big screen televisions there. But by midway through that speech, numbers had dwindled, and by the end of that speech, squares were largely empty, indicating a deep disgruntlement with the way Benjamin Netanyahu has handled these last few months.
Actually, the one square where I heard there was a screening was the one where there's an ongoing protest for the right of hostages, and I know there was a lot of disgruntlement. People were saying basically this is not a promising speech. People there who are expecting their family members who are held hostage by Hamas were hoping that he would say something about a deal, which he didn't. However, I think more broadly in the Israeli society, his speech was received very, very well. While in the US, it was creating rifts between different communities. Here, the vast majority, including staunch opposition to Netanyahu, were saying, this is an excellent speech. He's making a great case for Israel. There's no one in his league in terms of international diplomacy. So he was actually very warmly welcomed by most Israelis. Again, obviously, the families of hostages were a little bit disappointed.
Tell me about that, the protest of families of hostages and their response to Benjamin Netanyahu's government's actions in trying to eke out some sort of agreement to have those hostages return home.
Sure. So when the hostages families movement was just kind of launched days after the massacre and kidnapping of October 7th, they started by basically saying, we don't take a stand on the war, we don't take a stand on the government, we are just here to get our family members home. What they gradually realized as a movement was that there will be no hostage release without an end to the war, and there will be no end to the war without the toppling of this government. So gradually, this movement became an anti-war, anti-government protest movement for the most part. Basically, because of those same reasons I was mentioning earlier, the understanding that Netanyahu is just deeply invested in continuing the war and in not getting their hostages back home.
A death toll of more than 39,000 people dead in Gaza. What is the Israeli population's general sentiment or response to an increasing civilian death toll in Gaza? I know you work with Palestinians in your media organization, 972 magazine. What is the general feeling of Israelis to the ongoing war in Gaza? 39,000 people, many of them, most of them civilians, now dead.
It really, really pains me to say, as someone who's been both as a political activist and as a journalist resisting Israeli apartheid and the war for so long, it really pains me to say that the vast majority of Israeli society is not following, does not know what's happening in Gaza, is not interested, does not care. We're seeing this in Israeli media, where the stories that you are seeing, that people around the world are seeing in terms of what's happening in Gaza, they're just not told. They're just not shared in Israeli media. They're just not present. People are only talking about what's happening to us, not what's happening to Palestinians. And still, we are at a point where the vast majority of Israelis support a ceasefire, but only because our soldiers are dying and we want the hostages back. The care or the realization of what we're doing to Palestinians is generally just not there.
What would be the thought or the position of an Israeli government ahead of an American election, I think just over 90 days' time, and what the outcome of that election could mean for America's ongoing support materially of Israel? We had many Democratic members of the U.S. Congress either not attending that speech of Benjamin Netanyahu. There were outright protests also attended by Democratic Party members in the U.S. What could the outcome of the U.S. election mean for the ongoing support of Israel?
Well, it really depends on the result, and it also, if there was a Democratic win, it'll be interesting to see what Kamala Harris' position would be. We don't know that exactly yet. And what we are pretty sure is that Donald Trump will probably be a supportive president to Israel, which is why Netanyahu wants him elected. I think here in Israel, people are torn. The pro-Netanyahu camp are also a pro-Trump camp, and the anti-Netanyahu camp support the Democrats. But again, I think people are just waiting to see where Kamala Harris lands.
Haggai Matar, really appreciate your time. He is the executive director of 972 magazine. It's an independent online non-profit magazine. It's run by a group of Palestinian and Israeli journalists. Really appreciate your time.